So thank you very much and welcome to the very last panel of this conference. But nevertheless, we have a very urgent issue, one of the most probably urgent issues and relevant topics at the moment, which is hybrid threats, and which Lithuania and other NATO countries have been facing more and more frequently for the recent months, probably, if not a year. And a good example of that is, well, the recent NATO foreign ministers meeting, which was basically 1 week ago, that also focused on hybrid threats. And I believe we're going to also explore a bit deeper in our conversation why we had that meeting, what decisions did we make during that meeting. And also in addition to that, hybrid threats seem to be more and more visible and concrete, because for quite a long time, hybrid threats was quite a broad concept, but right now we see more and more concrete and physical examples how those threats affect our lives. Well, just to name a few: GPS jamming, internet cable disruptions, destruction of various strategic facilities, assassination attempts, sometimes even successful. So the list goes on, and those examples we can see in our daily lives. So a brief description of the format as usual. So I will ask each of our speakers to make an introductory remarks on the issue, up to 5 minutes. And later we follow with discussion. I will also remind for the audience, please use the Slido app and be active in this discussion. So please, brief introductory remarks from the first speaker adjacent to me. So please.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction. 3 brief points that I would like to make with regard to hybrid threats. First off, I don't really like the term hybrid threats, just because hybrid itself, it's an adjective that essentially means the combination of 2 elements, but it obfuscates more than it clarifies. And I think that's sometimes an issue for the policy process in general. I'd rather stick to very specifics, right? And if I think about the one so-called hybrid threat that worries me the most, it's really disinformation campaigns over the next couple of weeks and months pertaining to discussions within the European Union, Europe in general, but also the United States about the future of Ukraine, in particularly what role European countries will likely play in Ukraine when it comes to offering certain security guarantees. And I think this is something where Russia is already pretty active. It is going to be very active, and that, to me, besides the more physical aspects that we've seen, and some of which you've mentioned, bombings, sabotage attempts, operations in cyberspace, offensive operations in cyberspace, potentially even assassination attempts, as we've seen last year in Germany. These are important, but to me they're at the moment secondary to this very critical question about what exactly is Europe going to do in Ukraine and what kind of security guarantees Europe is going to give to Ukraine. And specifically, I'm talking about the big question whether we are going to deploy land forces or not, we as Europe, to Ukraine, to guarantee a potential ceasefire should it arise next year. And I think this ties into some elements that we've heard already on the last panel, excuse me, the one before the last, panel number 3, where we briefly touched upon Russian red lines, or NATO's red lines and so forth. I think inherent to these Russian disinformation attempts is the raise of escalatory or escalation fears among European policymakers' minds, and the United States, of course, to a certain degree, but primarily I think it's going to be targeted at European political decision makers and the European public at large. And the only antidote to this is essentially be aware that this is what's happening, and that the Russians are actively, or have an active interest in raising these escalation fears among policymakers in Europe. And let me be clear, I think it is absolutely warranted to have escalation fears. This is a very tricky situation we are in, particularly in this confrontation that we have with a nuclear armed power, and also because in general terms we're in an age of warfare, essentially dominated, and I think this is going to be even more so the case down the line, dominated essentially, or characterized rather, by long-range precision strikes, or precision strike capabilities, conventional precision strike capabilities. Now, as we have seen already over the last 2.5 years of this war in Ukraine, it is a constant evaluation, re-evaluation of vertical escalatory risks when it comes to the deployment of long-range precision strikes or precision strikes capabilities overall. If you are engaged in a war or in some sort of indirect Cold War type of confrontation with a nuclear-armed power. And I think this issue of essentially an inability in a moment of crisis to discriminate between conventional and nuclear payloads when it comes to long-range strike capabilities, this is something that the Russians are clearly very much focused on seizing. And I give you one specific example, and then I'm going to stop because I don't want to overstep my 5-minute introduction. Some of you may have been aware about the discussion that has been happening in Germany about the deployment, eventual deployment, of a so-called US Army multi-domain task force, which is essentially a task force consisting of various battalions, the most important element of which is, well, two important elements of which is a cyber electronic warfare ISR battalion, essentially, that is, conducting electronic warfare, tactical cyber operations, and so forth, and just essentially is trying to provide the rest of the multi-domain task force with a common operational picture of the battle space. And then a strategic fires battalion. Strategic fires battalion, which consists of HIMARS battery, a mid-range fire capability, and then some sort of longer-range hypersonic capability. Now, the Russians in the German information space were very quick to actually seize on vertical escalatory fears among German politicians and among the German public in general by essentially emphasizing that this multi-domain task forces, a strategic fires battalion, can actually threaten the Russian nuclear deterrent, and they immediately started a discourse on social media and in other media channels, essentially, amplifying messages of certain analysts, certain commentators in the German-speaking world that essentially tried to tie the deployment of this multi-domain task force to the NATO double-track decision, essentially SS-20 crisis in the 1980s. Where there's a lot of muscle memory about this particular incident, this, security crisis in the early 1980s, which really brought the nuclear fear to the forefront in Germany. And I think for us it's important to develop an understanding of what the genuine escalatory risks are of essentially merging nuclear with conventional long-range strike capabilities, at the same time trying to create a strategic culture, particularly in German-speaking Europe, that actually has the ability to objectively assess these risks, and at the same time also be fully aware that Russia is amplifying these sorts of escalatory risks, all now to the purpose, over the next couple of months, to essentially try to divide Europe when it comes to a unified response or clear and concrete commitments to help observe or at least stabilize a ceasefire, potential ceasefire line in Ukraine, and underwriting this with European military power, that is the deployment of land forces, European land forces to Europe, should this case ever arise. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Lieutenant General, your thoughts on the issue?
First of all, thank you very much, and congratulations for Linas Kojala and his team for the changing name of the center and for the great event. So I appreciate being part here of the great team of the experts. I'll do my interim remarks through a certain framework. First, I'll try to define hybrid understanding, hybrid threats, because it's a lot of discussions, and I do agree with you that it is we need to be careful how we're doing this. Then I'll talk a little bit about the possible NATO actions, what could be done in concerning the situation which is happening right now in Europe. But before that, I would like to emphasize that the hybrid warfare and threat is not the comfort zone for the military. And I'll explain that through the definition. So I'm not the one who's feeling here very comfortable of discussing about the hybrid, because it's a bigger part doing business about this is not the military. And I will ask the question right now, and leaving that later for the discussions, do we really have a hybrid warfare in the NATO territory right now? Because I would argue that the real hybrid warfare is happening in Ukraine because of the two elements, military and non-military elements playing part of that. Nevertheless, how, from my point of view, approach to the hybrid warfare definition? There are several elements which I would like to mention. First of all, it's two elements. It's military and non-military. So we can look right now at what we're having. The second one, it must be an integrated campaign of both elements with a very clear defined end state. It must be used surprise, initiative, psychological advantages. It must be sophisticated and rapid information flow, which mainly gives the domination in this sphere. Of course, electronic and cyber operations, covert, overt intel, military actions, and economical pressure. To be very short, all instruments of national power must be used in the hybrid warfare. And what gives the technology right now? Because the title says modern warfare and the hybrid. So technology provides opportunity to go beyond the reach and deeper to provide the effects, nothing else. The use of armed forces conventionally will be always below the threshold. That's the purpose of the hybrid warfare, not to trigger use of the conventional warfare. So that's the main reason on that. What is happening? What's Russia aim on this, what is right now with the security situation in Europe? Of course, it's the same, nothing new in this domain. So it's weaken, to divide, and ultimately neutralize NATO, and using all tools which is in the toolbox of Russia. NATO responses, and it was mentioned by Moderator about the foreign ministerial in Brussels. Here we need to understand that the NATO domain, the first understanding is that the response to the hybrid threat, first of all, must be national response. And through the national response is approach to the competing with the hybrid threat. Collectively, NATO is looking to facilitate and support nations if it's necessary, and of course mainly cooperating with other actors, and one of them is important is European Union side. NATO encouraging investing to the resilience of the critical national infrastructure. And I'm going right now through the lines which are kind of easy to define, but not that easy to make it practically. One of the important parts is to be aware what is happening. To be aware means the intelligence services, or to be more precise, counterintelligence services, must be more integrated into the NATO intelligence architecture. Currently, there is a challenge of working with the counterintelligence services in the NATO. Easier with the intelligence, much more difficult with the counterintelligence. And I think this is where the first step, the nations could overcome this limitation of sharing information and building the common NATO picture what's happening with the hybrid situation. Need to put the emphasis on the diplomatic response from the nations to be more coherent and firm. Very often in the past and currently, the certain events happening on our territories in the NATO nations, but we do not have a common approach from the NATO perspective with a firm diplomatic response to that. Since 2016, NATO agreed that the hybrid actions could lead to a decision to invoke Article 5. It's a strong statement, but to be honest, the biggest challenge is actually attribution. Every time happening something in the nation, there are a lot of actions and fuss, to be honest, about so who did that. Even informally and almost formally, everybody knows most likely it's Russia or another hostile actor. But it's so difficult to get to the agreement or consensus of the attribution, which could lead actually to invoke of Article 5, was out of this coming consequences, which are very serious. And I will be closing with the military part, talking about the defense capabilities. Now we are focusing on saying that we need to develop collective defense capability, Article 5 collective defense capability. Out of the regional plans, it's a huge list of capabilities we need to work, and the just nominated minister, she talked about the extensive pressure on this and finding the budget for that. the rule is that if we are capable to do the collective defense, and if we do have a collective defense capabilities, we will be able to cope on our side with a hybrid threat, which is relates with the military domain. And by this, I will hand back to you.
So thank you very much. So one of my questions is actually directly related to what just the Lieutenant General said. So, because up until now in a public domain, there is still a public discussion, should a clear red line should be drawn to activate an Article 5 as a response to the hybrid threat? If yes, where this line should be drawn? So what is your opinion on that? Firstly, should we have this line? Secondly, where we should draw this line? So yeah, please.
Oh, well, I guess it really depends again on what kind of operation we are talking about. A general blank check essentially for any types of hybrid threats, I think would not do, right? We need to be very concrete, and there's a reason why it's called hybrid threats, gray zone coercion, something below the threshold of armed conflict, right? I mean, we do know that certain cyber attacks can actually trigger Article 5, right? There's an agreement within the alliance and NATO. It all depends on the context in this regard. But I do think that definitions is one component, right? What's much more important, rather than the legal technicalities of what this really triggers and what it really constitutes at the end of the day, is how do we respond to it, right? And here, my fear is that sometimes we are way too reactive rather than too, proactive when it comes to some of these issues that some potential adversaries, or adversaries rather, are, posing essentially. And I think what we're seeing from actors such as Russia at the moment is a test. They're testing us in the West. That is, try a little thing here, try a little thing there, wait and see what the response is. And I think we've not been particularly good, at least in the public domain, from what I can see. I don't know what's happening behind closed doors in signaling Russia in particular that we are not going to stand for certain aggressions or certain acts of sabotage and so forth, right? So I think we need to be better here. I don't know whether the answer is that we have a clear textbook definition of what we're going to do. I don't think that's really necessary. There's a certain virtue in ambiguity in these types of things also. It's a concept in deterrence, obviously, right? That we respond. But what should be clear is that we respond strongly and that we respond in kind, or at least not in kind, proportional to what we are receiving. I'm not suggesting that we should also, sabotage, conduct sabotage operations or assassinations and so forth, don't get me wrong. But of course there are, certain things that we can do within the legal frameworks that we have. And the most important, or the last thing we should do is not to do anything in response to this.
Yeah, so maybe it's not necessarily have to be Article 5. We can also talk about other articles like Article 4, maybe even some other options. But
well,
yeah.
I mean, the other question is really, what's the first national response? The first response should be at the national level in these types of things, right? I mean, this idea, again, I think it's part of our strategic culture that we immediately think of NATO as the way to do certain things. No, I think first and foremost we need to do our own homework in our national, capitalists and in our countries and come up with solutions there. Of course, NATO is an important element in coordinating responses and stuff, but first and foremost, I do think that what we can do domestically, we should do.
Absolutely. Lieutenant General?
Yeah, I'll agree most of what was said. And there are 3 articles which are important in our sense. So Article 3, which is our national responsibility to prepare our defense and armed forces for any aggression. That would include hybrid threat as well. And you mentioned Article 4, which is also an important part. When the nation decides that it is above, they need to go and to do the consultation in the NATO. This is where they're looking for the possible response from the NATO. And I do agree that the Russia actually what is doing is just testing our red line and pushing back and forward, seeing, okay, so what will be the response? Is it wise from our side to draw the red line And to talk about this, I don't think so. Because ambiguity should stay also in the place, not only Russia playing with ambiguity towards us, but we also need to provide the ambiguity for the Russia to be guessing, so where is our red line, how are we doing this? Nevertheless, internally, either that in the NATO or internationally, we need to agree what does it mean, this red line for us, and how we will react and commit our actions to the red line which could be crossed.
So there is also a discussion how we should deter those threats. So there are two kinds of options and examples how we can do it. So one of them is to use symmetrical measures that could also respond in the same way as we feel the damage of those threats. And the other one is to use capacity building, to use sanctions, to use more, well, softer measures to answer those threats and to deter them in the future. So which one do you believe we should use, or maybe the answer is somewhere in the middle?
Well, I think obviously military options is just a small part of this portfolio that you need to respond to these diverse types of threats. I think I should add, though, that it's important also to understand if we are really talking about scenarios and what we would still classify as so-called hybrid threats, and if we go back to the original meaning of the term that was in part coined back in 2007, I believe, after the Second Lebanon War, we should not underestimate the type of formations that a country like Russia potentially would be able to deploy in the run-up to a military confrontation or high-intensity conflict with NATO. That is, if you think about countries that are not directly frontline states, such as Germany, right, that are really in the strategic depth of NATO and that are crucial for essentially transportation, like the most critical transportation hub essentially for any kind of military action in Eastern Europe, that is Germany, you would expect that Russia would also deploy sleeper cells, would deploy small-scale sabotage units, special operation forces, all this stuff, right? And these are really planning scenarios that are part of NATO's toolbox, so to speak. So I think we need to be, again, extremely specific because these types of threats obviously would require a military response, right? In combination with cyber operations, sabotage and so forth, where you divide it up. But I mean, I can't give you like an exact blueprint how to respond to any of this. I guess the most important element is that you do need a more comprehensive defense concept, something akin of what some of the Scandinavian countries have, a total defense concept that incorporates all of these elements, and then depending on what really specifically the so-called hybrid threat is, you respond to it, right? I do think we've made some progress in that area, let me say, over the last couple of years, but of course more needs to be done.
Please.
Couple things. First of all, of course, the whole response option portfolio, we need to look into all instruments of power which is available and to be very selective. And to be honest, I think NATO, at least to my knowledge, has a certain toolbox which could be used if it's necessary based on the discussions with the nations. What is important that NATO is cooperating together, at least with the European Union, much closer in the response towards the hybrid actions on the NATO or European Union member state territory. And I think this is one of the key components where could be really strengthened and added value. Nevertheless, I would conclude saying that the one domain, which is informational domain, we need to be sure that we are proactive in that domain. I think that we are a little bit more reactive side sitting, but the information domain is kind of safe to be proactive from our perspective as well, and to be sure that our messages are well received at the other end, not only saying that the deterrence is working, even we don't know how exactly that portrayed.
Yeah. So we have a few questions from the audience. So one is, I think, dedicated for Mr. Gady. So one of the more modern warfare tactics are neuro warfare, or maybe we'd also add, in addition to that, some psychological operations. So how do you think Lithuania and allies are ready to tackle this? Are we ready to react to possible threats in this field?
Sorry, it's about, I didn't hear the question entirely. It's about modern warfare, psychological warfare?
Yes, neuro warfare.
Neuro
Yes,
warfare?
yes.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, war is always a contest of wills, right? This goes back all the way to Clausewitz already in the 18th century, and before that, obviously, but just in terms of military theory. And I think I'm generally against, for example, classifying a new warfighting domain as a cognitive domain where you have all these, you group essentially information warfare, cyber operations, other enabling operations that you target, to essentially target the mind of your opponent. I think it's an important part of any type of military operation. I do think there's a lot of potential, so to speak, down the line when it comes to some emerging technological capabilities that we could use. We also need to be aware of, obviously, what the adversaries can do. But I don't see it really replacing existing means of achieving military success. This idea has been haunting US military doctrine, I would say, or military thought, ever since at least the end of the First World War. This idea of a so-called indirect approach to essentially through non-violent means, or at least in part non-violent means, to break your enemy's will to resist, right? There's this big ongoing debate of attrition versus maneuver. This is usually seen as part of a maneuverist approach, right? Essentially to dominate the so-called cognitive domain, neuro warfare, and so forth. I'm frankly more of a traditionalist in this sphere. I think the primary way to influence an adversary to give up is to inflict attrition upon your adversary. This usually is done through violent means. I think it's an illusion to think that this can really be done just in the information domain or through any type of new neuro warfare. I think it's a supplemental and amplifying approach, essentially, but it's not going to be the main effort of any type of modern military operation. At least it should not be. And I don't think we should change our force structure to really bet on this one thing, because what happens if we really can't achieve our effects and we essentially have given up other important capabilities to really focus and invest money on this capability, and then it turns out that it's not going to make that much of a difference.
Another question from the audience now for Lieutenant General Baltrėnas. So regarding what is happening in the Baltic Sea, and I think that is related to the internet cables, so how Lithuania and NATO responded so far?
Well, that's a good question, thank you. Whoever asked that. First of all, I think what NATO did is establish better situational awareness. We need to understand that with the naval domain, the vast waters in the sea, it's not something you need a lot of ships or vessels to be present. So that's what we need to understand, that it's not that easy to control this. But number one, what happened from the NATO perspective is the situational awareness with the presence of the naval assets in the Baltic Sea, establishing that awareness and ensuring more often and constant sea patrolling along the key underwater infrastructure. Of course, additional to that, the intelligent analysis and intelligent work, mapping out the whole underwater infrastructure. NATO, in the NATO headquarters, there is a task force which is dealing and analyzing the critical underwater infrastructure situation and providing the advices for the decision makers. And that was the first reactions to what the cables was happening. And of course, the investigation by the services and the governmental institutions is continuing, and the conclusions will be drawn.
So thank you. Another question for Lieutenant General Baltrėnas, but I think both speakers can react to that question. So Russians and other actors are using Western platforms to spread disinformation. So what is your advice to civil governments, and where should we start?
I will refer to what I said about being more proactive in the information domain, and that goes to the more practical side, which was asking the question, the platforms used in that. I think Lithuania went very good way of actually shutting down all channels from which Russia was able to influence or send the propaganda towards the Lithuanian population. That one of the means which I would advise to other Western countries further from the eastern border to do that. That would be one way. The other way of being more proactive and using actually the same our platforms to send our message to the eastern side. But the most important part is the education of our societies, that our societies are able and resilient to the propaganda which is actually coming from the east.
Mr. Gady?
Well, I think you mentioned it already, General. I think the most important element obviously has to be at the educational level. And again, I need to go back to this idea of total defense, or this concept of total defense, which a lot of European countries, particularly in Scandinavia, had during the Cold War. This is obviously a concept that has been revised, needs to be expanded, and I think an educational curriculum that sort of also raises awareness about these types of operation is crucial. I think a second point, though, is also there needs to be across Europe, at least, within the framework of the European Union, obviously NATO members are included here, perhaps also a closer look at whether all the legal perimeters, the legal frameworks are actually set up for more proactive defense effort online. And proactive defense or active defense in general, I think, is something that, again, we in Europe need to be better at. Shutting down certain networks, be more proactive in trying to get rid of certain material, and also strengthening our intelligence services, I think. It's going to be crucial for some of these operations at the end of the day. Also giving them, again, the legal frameworks to really conduct their operations, because there are some discrepancies that I see in certain countries when it comes to having the right legal framework for intelligence agencies to be more proactive in this regard.
A quick follow-up question, because Lithuania probably since the annexation of Crimea, so probably 10 years right now, has had very strict policy in regards to the Russian television channels, radio channels, spread of disinformation. We had even some bans. So what about German-speaking Europe? Could you compare the situation what it used to be 10 years ago and now, and what is the situation right now?
Well, I think there are certain countries in German-speaking Europe that actually lack the legal framework to be more proactive. That is even essential for common intelligence operations. So they need to rely essentially for various challenges from outside support or outside services, outside intelligence support for be more proactive and recognizing certain threats emanating from cyberspace, for example. I think there's a general lack of awareness still. There's also a lack of a total defense concept. I think a lot of stuff has happened since February 2022. I do think there's a particular issue that, again, is amplified by certain adversaries in the German-speaking world when it comes to particularly this term of hybrid threats. It's seen as an excuse to not essentially have to do more in the conventional sphere of military power. Like beginning from 2014 until, let's say, late 2021, the first couple of weeks of 2022, this idea of hybrid warfare, hybrid threats, has specifically in German-speaking Europe been seen as an excuse to essentially let your conventional military capabilities degrade. That is, the future of war was essentially hybrid warfare. And this was not alone in German-speaking Europe, but this was almost a hype, I would say. A hype that I always said was premised on really bad data and not fundamentally understanding the changing character of warfare nor the constant nature of war. And I think this is something that only little by little gets rectified. And this is something that needs to get rectified, though.
Yeah, and another question for Lieutenant General. So follow up on the Baltic Sea question, the response of war, does it do we do enough to deter Russia? Because it seems that it's just a little public signaling, so maybe you could also expand what other measures are also taken besides the accident in the Baltic Sea.
I would not dare to step to the deterrence domain, which was by much better experts than me talking about this. But I'll allow myself to go a little bit. Do we deter enough Russia with the current our actions and activities what we're doing? I think we do have a certain degree of deterrence in that. The difficult question is how we're measuring the deterrence. It depends on our framework of measurement that's saying, are we successful with the deterrence? Yes, Russia didn't attack us conventionally. It sounds like we deterred Russia from the conventional attack. Nevertheless, we just discussed 20 minutes extensively about the hybrid attacks. Most likely the conclusion is we didn't deter Russia from the hybrid attacks towards NATO. So what kind of actions should be taken? From the conventional side, the visible actions, more forces along the eastern border, more exercises along the eastern border, better strategic communication. And I know that what I'm saying, it sounds a little bit like nice saying, but this is what we on our side as a military doing. And it's a complex of this deterrence goes with all instruments of national power. It's not only military, it's diplomatic, it's economical, you name it. It's a lot of them. So could we do better? Yes, of course we can. But it depends how we measure the success of our actions.
Yes, so I think we are out of questions right now. So thank you very much for both of our speakers, and the last big round of applause.
Thank you.